The billionaire was extremely flamboyant. Before the trial began, he demanded that the judge pause so he could finish his cup of coffee before proceeding. But suddenly, he began vomiting blood and had to be rushed to the hospital immediately. He requested a private room, but the hospital currently only had double rooms available. In fact, this hospital belonged to Edward Cole. Earlier, he had said that the Cole Hospital was not a nursing home. At least one room should have 2 beds. He intended to make some money, but ended up harming himself instead. To prevent negative media coverage, he had to settle for a double room, but unexpectedly, the adjacent room contained an elderly black man. The billionaire Edward displayed his disdain, but had no other choice but to accept with tears in his eyes. Soon after, the results of his tests came back. He had advanced stage cancer and needed immediate surgery. It was quite ironic that a top billionaire had no relatives to visit him at this time. Only his assistant came to report on his work situation. Edward could only helplessly struggle on his hospital bed every day. He greatly admired the black patient next to him, as his wife brought him meals daily, and his son also came to visit. Edward could only comfort himself alone, feeling envious but unable to express it. He constantly clashed with the elderly black man, but the man paid no attention, choosing instead to read history books to pass the time. In contrast, Edward had no cultural knowledge beyond his wealth. He was dissatisfied with every meal that didn't include meat. Carter advised Edward to eat more healthily, but Edward dismissed the suggestion. After all, wasn't it just a matter of craving meat? Shortly afterward, the truth hit Edward hard. The first surgery was successful, but during the recovery period, his body began to suffer intense pain, which tormented him to the point of losing his humanity. His neighbor was equally suffering, and the two found mutual understanding in their shared pain. They began to empathize and grow closer, later playing cards and walking together. One day, while the two were lying in the hospital room, the doctor came in with bad news. The doctor informed them that they had only about a year left to live. Upon hearing this, Edward felt as though his world was shattering, while Carter remained calm and said nothing. However, when facing death, everyone inevitably feels fear. Carter crumpled the paper in his hand, and Edward picked it up to find it was Carter's will. Edward read it and mocked Carter. He then took out a pen and added a few more things, such as skydiving, getting a tattoo, traveling everywhere, etc. Carter then read the paper and saw the line about wanting to kiss the most beautiful woman in the world. Carter laughed heartily, and they both proceeded to sketch out their wishes. Since life was short, why not explore the world and see new things? Thus, they decided to follow their wishes and go skydiving to experience life. Carter was quite nervous, but now there was no turning back. Eventually, they landed safely and then went to get tattoos. Although Carter was determined not to get one, he believed his body belonged to his parents and should not be violated. Despite Edward's persuasion, Carter remained firm in his decision. Next, they went to a racetrack, each driving a race car, which thrilled Carter immensely. He even played around with his car, bumping into Edward's vehicle. They enjoyed racing together and then traveled to a beautiful small town. They ordered the most luxurious and expensive dishes to eat. Suddenly, when they talked about Carter's daughter, Carter felt very emotional. He took out the will and wrote down his beautiful wishes for Edward and his daughter. However, Edward immediately took it back and erased everything. Carter, feeling embarrassed, quickly went to the bathroom to calm down. Edward waited a long time, but didn't see Carter return, so he went to look for him. It turned out that Carter's lung had burst and his clothes were soaked with blood. Just as he was about to call the doctor, Carter's wife called and wanted to speak privately with Edward. Edward knew Carter's wife was worried about him and wanted him to spend his remaining days with family. Without much thought, Edward went upstairs to persuade Carter. The lung bleeding was very serious, so their travel plans had to be postponed. However, Carter immediately refused. Carter had suspected that his wife called Edward to persuade him to return home. But Carter knew that he was only adding a burden to his family. The world is so vast, and it's meant to be enjoyed. Seeing Carter looking so serious, Edward had no choice but to accept. They continued their journey of exploring the world, traveling together to Africa to play on the vast grasslands with the local wildlife. They even climbed a pyramid to watch the sunset. At this moment, Carter asked Edward if he had found joy in his life. Edward then shared that his daughter had married an abusive man. She was beaten every day, so he quickly found a woman who also loved violence. But after that, his daughter ended the relationship with her husband and never saw him again. Their next trip took them to drive along the Great Wall of China with great enthusiasm. They then traveled to the snowy mountains in Malaysia, which was also their final wish. But unfortunately, they encountered a severe snowstorm and were unable to climb the mountain. This snowstorm was expected to last until the next spring. Obviously, they couldn't wait that long, so they returned to Hong Kong together. Later, they went to a bar to have a drink. Suddenly, a seductive black woman appeared next to Carter. They shook hands, and the woman invited Carter to her room to play cards. Carter felt embarrassed and politely declined because he felt he should spend his remaining moments with his family. Seeing this, Edward smiled. After returning home, while they were on their way, Carter discreetly asked the driver to pass by Edward's daughter's house, hoping that Edward and his daughter might reconcile. However, Edward was too afraid to face his daughter to apologize, so he tore up the will in front of Carter. Afterwards, the two left without any joy. Edward immediately returned to his luxurious mansion, but the house was empty. He was left alone, and despite his outward strength, he silently cried when alone. Carter, on the other hand, enjoyed his time with his family after returning home, but he also felt remorse for Edward, as close companionship naturally breeds affection. At this time, Edward wanted to call Carter to apologize, but he suddenly received bad news. Carter had to be hospitalized urgently because the cancer had metastasized. There was no other option. The doctors had to attach hundreds of tubes to Carter. The lights were prepared for the surgery. Before entering the operating room, Carter confided in Edward. They shared a joyful laugh, but Carter couldn't stop crying. Later, Carter took out the will and folded it, as he still clearly remembered their wishes. It turned out that Carter had picked up the will that night and reattached it. In the end, Carter couldn't hold on any longer. Edward then visited his daughter's house. The argument that day made the granddaughter accept him as her grandfather. So Edward's wish was fulfilled, to kiss the most beautiful girl in the world. Following this, he attended Carter's funeral and fulfilled his wish of helping a complete stranger. Shortly after, Edward passed away. Edward's assistant buried the ashes of both men together. This was also their final wish. The friendship between them was truly beautiful, wasn't it? And what about you? Pick up the phone and call your best friend to share this video. Don't forget to like and share to support us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.